Well, hi everyone, this is Dean Woodbeck from InCommon. Thank you for joining us for today's IAM Online. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Tom Barton from the University of Chicago and Internet2. Tom?
Thanks, Dean, and hi everybody. Thank you for joining today's IAM Online, which is the monthly webinar focused on identity and access management. IAM Online is brought to you by InCommon, Internet2, and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. So we always take questions and comments using the Zoom chat function. So do send those messages during the presentation. I'll do my best to bring messages to the attention of the presenters during their presentation. I'll interrupt them if necessary. Now, one thing you'll have to note, the chat button down there, if you look closely at the bottom of your Zoom screen, it defaults to sending your messages just to the panelists. Please, you'll see there's a drop-down right there. Check the one that sends it to everybody. Go ahead and do that right now so that when you send out a question or a comment, everyone can see it. All right, so this is, I think of this as sort of the second installment of a two-part series that the IAM Online has been fortunate to host. Last time, which was 2 months ago, in terms of going passwordless, we heard from Michael Duff of Stanford about their X509-based password authentication approach that has a lot of things in common with and a number of things different from what Mary and Shillen are going to tell us about what Duke is doing with their WedAuthn-based approach. One of the differences that you'll see, and I would encourage folks who have been perhaps were also on the Stanford one to think about what's alike and what's not alike between the two approaches. But security posture checking is one of those areas that Stanford is leveraging. It's not dependent upon having security posture checks, but it kind of bolsters, in my opinion, their overall passwordless approach. Whereas in the case of the WebAuthn and Duke's approach, it doesn't really seem to, it doesn't seem to have the same kind of a need. But one thing that's a big thing in common is that they are using federation. Both schools use federation internally to a very large extent, and it's a huge lever for them. They get a bunch of apps with one integration, that is with their, in each case, their Shibboleth Identity Provider. Could you move to the next slide, please? So folks who saw my intro last time will be disappointed to see I didn't come up with something better than this slide, which is the same as I did last time. I kind of wanted to set the stage. This is sort of best practice using passwords right now. You can see some person sitting there at their laptop or something typing in. They're using their password to a login screen on their identity provider, which checks it against their password store, LDAP or Active Directory or what have you. And federation technology, and technologies, there are several different ones, that send assertions or claims, but not the password, to applications. And so that's actually good. You reduce the exposure of those passwords to just, kind of in-house, just the identity provider and so forth. But it's not good enough because there's that person sitting there at their laptop, and that's where their passwords are obtained from, not sniffing over the wire on that arrow between the IDP and the app, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so with passwordless, there's kind of two main changes. I think the most important one for me is thinking about what the user's doing and how they're authenticating themselves. They're doing it on their phone or their laptop for the most part with a biometric or a PIN, thumbprint, PIN, face, what have you, and their phone or the mobile device is using, depending on the two approaches, different sorts of cryptographically sound methods of proving to the identity provider that those devices are the right ones. They're bona fide. And so the identity provider checks them in a device registry in some fashion. So the X509 approach that Stanford took, for a lot of reasons that are not particularly technical, but very substantial reasons, that really can't scale. It's great for inside of an organization. Probably won't scale beyond that, or not by much. WebAuthn was created for the World Wide Web, and likely could provide a way for a user to have an experience with their home institution that's very much like their experience out as a consumer in the world as well, which may be an additional point of comparison. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary and Shillen. By the way, I was taught long ago that Shillen is Chillin. That's how you pronounce his name. So just so you all know as well. Please take it away, Mary or Shillen.
Great. Thank you, Tom. So this is nearly the same presentation that we did last month at the Internet 2 Technology Summit, or Technology Exchange. But even though that was just last month, we wanted to make sure to cover the things we talked about there. And we also have quite a lot of news since last month, so we'll cover that at the end. But the general format of what we wanted to cover are sort of the whys, which I think you'll find are very similar to Stanford's motivations, a general overview of what WedAuthn is as a technology and what it does, how we deployed our WedAuthn implementation, which we call Duke Unlock, and then the future, where we're going to go from here, how we're going to scale this to apply to more services, more contexts, more things like that. So the first piece of the presentation is the why. So we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about why we see passwords as a losing strategy and something that we really need to be figuring out alternatives for. And this started out in January of 2018 with a quest for us to make passwords more secure. We realized that we were going to have to come up with some better password standards, and we wanted to come up with one that would not inconvenience people by having to get replaced in another year or another 2 years. And we really wanted to figure out, what are we going to do that is going to be a standard that will keep Duke students, faculty, staff safe for years to come? And we thought, well, we're nerds and we're pretty good at math, and so we'll be able to figure out a way to help users generate sufficient entropy in their passwords to be resilient against cracking, and something that they can set once and forget about, and they'll be able to use it via our single sign-on mechanisms for years to come. Unfortunately, we realized that there's a lot more complication to this problem than we thought. The first thing is that humans are really predictable, and thus human-generated passwords are very predictable. Adversaries know that. They know that if we require you to have a special character in your password, it's probably going to be an exclamation point, and it's probably going to be the first character, the last character, or a delimiter between words. So password cracking algorithms account for that sort of thing. We're no longer in this isn't your grandmother's brute force password cracking technology. We're now looking at quite a few more sophisticated methods for breaking things based on the fact that there is kind of a limited range of things that human behavior indicate when it comes to human-generated passwords. Another thing that's not going well for us is that graphical processing units, as opposed to CPUs, are really good at password cracking, and that compute power is more accessible than ever. So it's great that we've democratized access to this kind of compute power, but when you can buy just what you need in the cloud, it makes it a lot easier for people to start getting into the business of cracking passwords. And then the last thing is that the NIST digital identity guidelines show that most of our tactics are actually counterproductive. So the digital identity guidelines recommend against prescriptive character classes. They recommend against security questions and regular prescriptive password changes. So after 5 months, we admitted defeat. We had pretty much tried everything. So what we've learned is that passwords that are generated by humans are not secure, and passwords that are generated by computers are not as broadly usable as we would like. We really tried everything. We tried salting users' generated passwords with something random to try to up the entropy, but every iteration of our thoughts of what is our new best password standard going to look like, we would hand over to Duke's IT security office, and the first thing that they would do is crack it in a humiliating amount of time with a humiliatingly low and accessible number of resources. That sent us back to the drawing board. So we wanted to think, what is working in terms of securing accounts and how can we leverage it? So the first thing that is working well is password managers. We have a tool for that. We find that password managers help you manage secure user-generated passwords, but we have to convince everybody to use it. And if that's our only approach, that seems like it may be a tough sell to get everybody using password managers. And there might be some political cost in forcing people to use password managers. So that has some benefits, some drawbacks. The second option is multi-factor authentication for everyone all the time. We see that multi-factor authentication is extremely, extremely effective, But we do have a lot of user fatigue with the current requirements, and there is both a political goodwill and also financial scaling cost with telephony credit increase if we're trying to force people to use MFA all of the time. The third option was actually doing exactly what Stanford has done, which we really admire, and they were definitely the pioneers in this field. We were very impressed with it. But we don't have currently a good X509 certificate solution that would scale for use in this kind of case. And so for us, the significance of the initial cost would offset other priorities of things that we wanted to do. And so we really struggled with that. And we looked at a few different ways to do it, but ultimately we weren't sure that we had the resources to do that. Which is why our joking option number 4 was paralysis by analysis. We have these options. We know the first 3 things are good, solid approaches, but we're not sure that we can fit that in because at the end of the day, we still have identities to manage, and we are worried that we don't have a great solution for this problem that we can afford to implement. So just as we were considering career changes, we got a question from the person who was hacking all of our test passwords, and that's Nick Tripp, who manages the IT security office. And he said, well, what about WedAuthn? WedAuthn is something that would give you what you're looking to do. It's a new standard. It supports native authenticators, which is something that we'd gotten a lot of feedback about, like, why can't I use Touch ID for this? Why can't it be as easy as, unlocking my computer with my face? It can combine multiple factors for a really simple multi-factor experience. And it's open source and straightforward to explore, so it wouldn't cost us too much to dip our toe in the water and then throw it away if it wasn't good. Just so you know who we're dealing with, and I like to give Nick Tripp a hard time, Nick manages the IT security office. He once cracked the old XKCD classic password correct horse battery staple from a hash for about $70 of compute in the cloud in less than a day. And this photo was supplied to us by Jesse Bowling, who some of you may know. Of course, Jesse had to find the funniest picture we could find of Nick, but he is completely sober and drinking water in that photo. So that got us intrigued about WebAuthn, and I'm going to pass it over to Shilin to talk about how we explored next steps with that technology and what WebAuthn is and does.
Yep, so I'm going to talk about what WebAuthn is and does and some of the technical details behind that. So first, I'll start with the FIDO2 project. So the FIDO2 project is an open authentication standard that was published by the W3C for strong passwordless authentication. It allows the use of public-private key pairs to allow you to delegate authentication over to a device that you have in your possession. And the great thing about it is that on its own, it could do multi-factor authentication without requiring any additional factors. So the project is composed of 2 primary parts: the W3C Web Authentication API, or WebAuthn, and the FIDO2 Client to Authentication Protocol, or CTAP2. You could think of WebAuthn as being the JavaScript API that runs in the browser and connects to the backend servers, and it's supported by most of the major browser vendors at this point. And CTAP2, you can consider that the protocol that's used to communicate between the browser and the authenticator. So now we'll talk about some of the things that WebAuthn can support. So first of all, it can support native authenticators. These are also known as platform authenticators or internal authenticators. These are authenticators that actually live on your system. So if you have a MacBook Pro, for example, the Touch ID on there is a platform authenticator. If you have an Android device, then the fingerprint scanner on there or the facial recognition, those will also be platform authenticators. Then there are roaming authenticators. These are also called external authenticators. They connect to your system through some protocol like USB or NFC. And YubiKeys are a popular option here. WebAuthn can also support single-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication, and I'll get into a bit more detail on that on the next slide. WebAuthn can also support device attestation. So the idea there is that when an authenticator is manufactured, it can have an attestation specific private key that is basically burned into it. And the idea is that all authenticators of the same model from the same vendor would have that same private key that is securely burned into it. And during registration with us, there's some data that is signed by the authenticator using that attestation private key that would be sent over to us that would allow us to know more information about the authenticator. Maybe in the future we can integrate with a metadata service that can provide some of those additional pieces of information and what features it supports. Now, it should be mentioned that not all authenticators can securely protect an attestation private key, and those authenticators would be self-attested. So at Duke, we save all of the attestation information during registration, but we don't currently do anything with it. But we may in the future. So in the future, if we realize that a specific authenticator has been breached or hacked in some way, and we need to quickly discard those registrations, then we're able to do that, and we're able to know who's using them and contact those users, for example. WebAuthn can also support device filtering and selection, and that's using the attestation data. So currently at Duke, we allow any FIDO2 compliant authenticator to be registered with us, but in the future, we may decide that we only want to allow certain types of authenticators that meet the best security practices, for example. So wait, how is this actually multi-factor authentication? So in order to be multi-factor, you generally have to have two of the following three things. Something you have, like a registered device, something you are, which is usually biometrics, like a fingerprint or a facial recognition, and something you know, like a password, PIN, or gesture. And so WebAuthn can be implemented in many different ways. There are some sites out there that maybe don't care about MFA. Maybe today they're only doing password authentication, and then they want to replace that password authentication with WebAuthn. And in that case, they would be using WebAuthn as a single factor. There could be some sites out there that use password as one factor and something else as a second factor, and they want to replace that second factor with WebAuthn. So again, they would use a password and WebAuthn as a single factor to have two factors. And then there's what we're doing, which is actually using WebAuthn as two factors. And the way that works is by using a feature of WebAuthn called user verification. And the way that works is that before your authenticator is willing to send us an assertion, you have to prove your identity to it by either using biometrics or a PIN. So the first factor would be having possession of that authenticator, and the second factor would be authenticating to your authenticator with a PIN or facial recognition or with a fingerprint. And in the end, the authentication that's happening through the user verification is happening locally on your system. So we're not saving any of your biometric data or your PINs or so forth. You're authenticating to your authenticator with that, and only after that authentication succeeds would your authenticator be willing to send an assertion over to us. And we know folks are often uneasy about using biometrics, and that's fine. The way you achieve MFA is between you and your device. So now let me talk a little bit about the authentication flow. So in order for authentication to happen, the user has a private key that's on their authenticator. The identity provider has the associated public key. The identity provider would create a challenge that has to be successfully signed by the user's private key in order to achieve authentication. So at Duke, we integrated WebAuthn with our Shibboleth IDP, and we did that using the Yubico Java libraries. So we did our initial integration more than a year ago, and at that time we were looking to see what other folks may have implemented. And we found that Yubico had a very good Java library for this, and so we integrated that with our IDP. So the way the flow works is that the user first goes to the website that they're trying to get into in the end. So this is generally some Shibboleth SP. And that Shibboleth SP will see that they don't have a valid session at that time, so it would redirect the user over to the WedAuthn reliant party, which in our case is the Shibboleth IDP. The Shibboleth IDP would send a WedAuthn request to the user that would include the challenge, the user verification requirements, which in our case state that the user verification is indeed required, and the list of registered credentials. The browser would then validate the origin to make sure that there isn't a phishing situation going on, and it prompts the user to choose an authenticator. The user chooses the authenticator and completes user verification. The authenticator creates the assertion, assigns the data including the challenge and the authentication flags, which include the user verification requirement, and that data is then returned to the browser and then to the IDP. And then the IDP would do its validation to make sure that the signature checks out correctly using the Yubico libraries and make sure that user verification was indeed done. And if everything looks good, then that was multi-factor authentication, and the flow proceeds from there, and the user eventually gets to where they're trying to go. So now let me talk a little bit about the registration process.
Hey, Shailen, before we get to registration, if I could interrupt, there's a question in the chat about, is this just for the web? Can you use WedAuthn somehow to log into Active Directory on-prem from a workstation, or other kinds of context besides web?
Yeah, so we have a little bit more of that later on in our slide deck, but I guess I'll just mention it now that we have seen discussion on the OpenSSH mailing list, for example, that there's experimental support of using FIDO with WedAuthn or with OpenSSH. So there is definitely more that can be done in the space, and it looks like folks are definitely working towards that. So I'm not immediately sure about Active Directory, what that integration would look like, but I'm guessing something could be figured out.
Thanks.
So to proceed with the registration process, so at the time of registration, the user's authenticator would create a new public-private key pair. And the idea is that every place where the user is using their authenticator, every place would have its own public-private key pair. So this one would be specific to our Shibboleth environment. The private key is obviously stored on the authenticator, and we get the public key. In fact, all the data that we store about the authenticator is all somewhat public data. So we don't have any private keys. We don't have any biometric data or any pins or anything like that. And so if, for example, our WedAuthn registration data got hacked, it wouldn't be as big of an issue since we don't have any private credentials that could be stolen. So the Yubico code that we integrated with stored all the registration data in memory, and we adjusted that to be able to store that in a relational database. So that's what we've done here, and that's what that screenshot shows. So during our registration process, we really only have a single text box that we give to the user, which is where they can supply a nickname for their authenticator. And after they do that, they go through the normal browser prompts to complete the registration and to do user verification. And so some of the information that we store include the user handle, which is a long, opaque sequence of bytes that's privacy preserving. There's the credential type, which is public key, always currently. There's the credential ID, which is another long sequence of bytes that's generated by the authenticator. There's the actual public key. There's the signature count, which increments each time that authenticator is used. And that's used to determine if there's a potential cloned authenticator out there. So for example, if I'm using my authenticator every day and somehow somebody has cloned my authenticator and they've used it, then the signature count in the database would increment, but my signature count would be what it was before. So the next time I use my authenticator, we can detect that that the signature count incremented without me actually using my authenticator, which might indicate that somebody might have cloned my authenticator. There's the attestation type, which could be self-attested or not. The attestation data, which I mentioned before, which we just store right now and we may use later on. And we keep track of the registration time and the nickname that they selected. And at the end of the registration process, we encourage folks to actually go through an authentication process to confirm that everything is working as expected. So when we first rolled this into production, it was a very limited pilot. Initially, we were sending out invitation emails because we wanted to make sure that everyone that was registering initially, we spoke to directly about it. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One was, since this was a very new technology, the support for it was also very limited, especially when we initially rolled this out. And so we wanted users to either be in a situation where they can quickly register and quickly use the service and really love it, or quickly realize that the service wasn't ready for them. We wanted to make sure that users weren't spending a lot of time trying to use it just to figure out, after a lot of debugging, that it wasn't supported on their device. And second, since this was just rolled out, we wanted to make sure that we were watching folks as they were registering so that we could take into account any usability issues that folks were running into so we can adjust our processes. So I think the day after we actually rolled this out into our production environment as a pilot, Mary and I sat in a conference room and we basically messaged a bunch of people in the same building and told them that we have a new authentication method in production. And if they wanted to try it out, they can bring their laptops and their phones with them to the room and we would help them get registered. And the response we saw from that was beyond what we had expected. There were so many people that were so excited that there was a new authentication process that was now available that was not only more secure, but also easier to use. And we also learned a lot from that registration event, and we made adjustments to our process from that. After that, we sent a professional usability person out into the field. They basically went on campus, found random employees and students, and asked them to register for the service so that they can do some formal testing. And eventually, we got to the point where we were comfortable with our processes, and we were willing to send out invitation emails to folks and just collected feedback through email. So this is what our pilot timeline has looked like. We initially did our proof of concept in October of 2018. And at that time, we were actually approaching this whole thing in a very different way. We were planning on using certificates as one factor and using WedAuthn without user verification as another factor. And there are a couple of reasons for that. At that time, the WedAuthn spec wasn't even finalized. So we were a little worried about using WedAuthn as the sole means of authentication when that spec wasn't even final. And two, the user verification support was very limited at that point, so we couldn't really rely on it. But in March of 2019, the WedAuthn spec did become finalized, so that concern went away, and the user verification support was getting better. And we also had come to the realization that deploying certificates at Duke was going to be an uphill challenge for us. Not only the cost associated with that, but a lot of motivation for passwordless authentication happens when you have to use it on your mobile devices, since that's one of the most difficult places to actually type in a password. And a lot of mobile devices are personal, and trying to get a Duke certificate installed on every personal device was not going to be an easy thing as well. So at this point, we decided to fully go into WedAuthn and use user verification to achieve MFA. In July of last year, we did our initial production deployment and did our initial testing. In September, we had a service branding session with our usability folks where we spent hours with them and eventually came up with the name of the service, which is Duke Unlock. In October, our usability folks came out with their formal usability report. And since then, we've been making updates to our processes to take their feedback into account. And then finally, in November, we released our second version of our login screen. And Mary's going to show that and talk about some more details on how we deployed WedAuthn.
Thanks, Dylan. So this section is about how we deployed Duke Unlock from a proof of concept to a full-fledged pilot. And when we were undertaking that, I think the first thing that we wanted to think about was a values discussion, which I think is always a good place to start when you're launching a new service, because no service can be everything. And you really have to keep coming back to what are we trying to accomplish here. So for Duke Unlock, we have 4 basic core service values. The primary one is security. We are looking to expand coverage of MFA and increase user engagement on account security so that people are increasingly thinking of IT security as something that they participate in and not something that happens to them that is just administratively taken care of. The second thing is community. We have had a mixed reputation, and by mixed, I mean that euphemistically. We have been pretty unpopular with a lot of groups on campus in terms of our expectations of how they do multi-factor authentication. And we really wanted to take this opportunity to let this be a community-shaped service. So this is something we want to listen to feedback and frustrations. And our primary metric of success is word-of-mouth referrals. So we want to make sure that this is something that has enough legs that after someone does it, they tell their colleagues and friends about it. The third thing, which we kind of touched on earlier, is thrift. We didn't have the resources to put a lot of time or money or expense into this. So our thought was, this is purely an experiment. If it doesn't resonate with the community, we'll throw it away, like we've thrown away very many other IAM projects that didn't really resonate with the community. And so we will only invest insofar as people are responding to us and asking for more. We want to make sure that, on the thrift note, that we're scaling use of MFA without scaling the cost of MFA. And we also want to make sure that the thrift extends to our community. So we don't want people to have to spend more money or more time in order to use secure authentication. And in that way, we sometimes think of WebAuthn authentication as BYO MFA, bring your own multi-factor. If you have a device that you picked because it's personal to you and you really like its security features, which we find a lot of times people have strong opinions about that, then as long as that feature meets the minimum requirements that we have on our side, we will let you use the device you chose to verify your identity with us. And then the last thing is progress. We are not focused on building a service that is going to get 100% coverage today or is going to replace passwords completely next month. What we're looking to do is start building a relationship with the community to form a service that can replace passwords in the future and skate where the puck is going. So it's not
Mary, your audio has cut out for me. We'll get Mary back. Just wait a minute, folks. I like the comments about the puck, by the way, in the chat, but we lost Mary right after her hockey reference. That's interesting. And I will, as soon as we get Mary back and she finishes this slide, I really like the question. I had planned to ask a question similar to what Scott put in the chat about what happens when a user loses their phone or their YubiKey or something. And then there's a couple parts to that question, and I know that they'll have a good answer once they're able to give an answer.
Hello, we're back. Sorry about that.
Oh, good, Mary, because, you know, my tap dance wasn't really working very well. So if you'll finish this slide, okay? I've got a couple of questions I'll engage you with after the slide.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, the final thing I was really going to say on this slide was that we are less concerned with what devices freshmen have at Duke in 2020 and much more interested in what devices freshmen will be bringing to campus in 2025. So one of the things we have to keep coming back to is this is not an overnight problem, but can we try to make sure that we are attuning our investments in a direction that is going to be more viable over time as opposed to less.
So Mary, the question someone asked in the chat right around the time your voice dropped out was about what happens when someone loses their phone or their YubiKey or whatever. Are they just locked out? Is there a fallback mechanism? And then there's a second part I'll ask after you address that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I think there's kind of two aspects to that. The first one is the usability piece. And at this point, we are not talking about removing people's ability to log in the traditional way with passwords, which will demo that kind of ability to fall back. I do look forward to the time where people are opting out of that being something that is allowed on their account, but we're not there yet. As far as the potential for theft or something like that, which I think is another thing you have to think about when devices could be lost, stolen, or otherwise compromised, one thing that's really nice about the Duke Unlock implementation is because of the user verification feature that Shilin was talking about, having access to a physical device is insufficient for getting access to Duke resources. So your device has to not only be registered with us, but it has to be something that can uniquely identify that it can tell the difference between you and someone else with access to your phone via something like Face ID or a PIN. And I think the last thing is that this isn't a problem that is new in this landscape. This is something that we deal with all the time, people forgetting passwords or saving the password in their browser, which we wish people didn't do, but we've learned through this project is actually very common. What happens when you need to regain access to your account? And I think it's worth noting from a security perspective that if somebody's password is compromised, it's very likely that they don't know about it ever or for a very long time. And generally, it's the security folks that figure that out and we'll have to let them know because the signs are not that clear. Whereas we're so dependent on our personal devices that if we lose one, we know right away, and it is an emergency, not just for access to university resources, but for general life existence to remediate that right away.
Great, and so that's sort of a fallback you addressed. What about, so it's lost or been broken and I have a new one, and is it just another registration or is there anything to kind of link me to the previous one that's part of that process at Duke?
So every device, and we'll go through what registration looks like later in this presentation, but you can register as many devices as you want, and we're working on making it easier to unregister devices as well.
Great. And then I have one more question along this line, which is, you know, there's, I think in WebAuthn the term is a recovery service, and thinking not just about Duke's context or a person at their, you know, where they're employed, but also using that same phone out as a consumer or a private person out on the web, where they, you know, there'll be similar registrations and so forth. Is Duke considering providing recovery services that are useful beyond Duke's own applications?
Beyond Duke's own application. I mean, I think we're talking about Duke's credentials. So we do have a lot of thoughts about how recovery would work for Duke credentials, but I'm not sure if I understood your question.
Okay, and I probably don't know how to pose it correctly, so I'll go on. There are a few other questions. Maybe most notably is with the fallback to username password. In that case, are you also then requiring Duo or your previous multi-factor authentication, or does fallback mean that it goes to a weaker authentication for a period of time?
No, fallback means that you go back to what you would have to do normally, which may or may not involve a second verification step. But one thing that I think is really exciting to us about Duke Unlock is that through use of that service, people are opting into a higher level of assurance authentication transaction. So it doesn't cost them anything more to log in a multi-factor sort of way. So we're seeing a lot more multi-factor happening as an opt-in sort of thing because it doesn't cost folks any more to do it through their phone, and it's actually quite a lot easier.
Yeah, cool. And then finally, to catch us up, so about the device, the phone, do you have any particular, any standards? I think I heard Shillen say that you're not imposing any constraint on what people can register with you, so provided it works, it supports all the right stuff. But is that where your thinking is, and is it likely to stay there?
Yeah,
you're going to want to
say
what's okay. So you're not to the point of figuring out that some things just aren't good enough yet.
Right.
And I'm sorry, Shillen, please proceed.
I'm sorry. But yeah, that's correct. Right now, we allow people to register any FIDO2 compliant authenticator as long as it supports user verification. And at this point, I think we're just trying to figure out what devices folks have, and we're willing to accept anything. But yeah, in the future, we might spend more time analyzing the different authenticators out there and decide if we want to accept or reject.
And just to be great, and just to be clear, you're not doing anything like somehow forcing the PIN to be, 6 digits long or anything like that, are you? Or what's up with that?
No, we don't have any control over requirements like that.
No MDM anywhere in the picture.
No.
And that kind of goes along with some of the service values Mary just told us about. Okay, please proceed, guys.
So I'm going to skip through a few things quickly because we have some time to make up. But basically, as a result of these service values, what we wanted to do was put the very most minimal of minimal viable products together to start getting this out. So at this time, we did not yet have a name for the service, but this was Duke Unlock version 1. It was, you had to type your NetID and tab out as though you were going to your password, and at that time, we would do a little AJAX type check to see whether you were registered, and if so, you would get this secret link that said go passwordless. And you needed to click that every time in order to prompt a WebAuthn transaction. The problems with that user interface kind of speak for themselves, but we were looking to make sure that we were putting minimal disruption into the identity provider, and this worked enough to make sure that we were getting people going. We found basically 6 major issues with our first round of pilot users, and of those 6 major ones, we found that there were 4 that we could act on. So those were making sure that people understood what the service was, why it works, why it's more secure, that people were engaged and they said, yes, this is something that solves a problem for me, that registration was not leaving anyone behind, and that when we didn't anticipate, people would remember to use it. So the first thing that we did to try to deal with user grasp, we had a branding workshop, and Duke has a really amazing UI UX team called Creative and UX led by Barbara Puccio. Some of you on the call have heard me talk about her before, but I just really love their work. And Barbara let us work with Lauren Hirsch, who's an information architect at Duke, and we came to Lauren saying, we're poor, our service value is thrift, we can pay you for 2 hours here. And in those 2 hours, we need a name and a elevator pitch. Those are the 2 things. We need to make sure that we have a good way to talk about the service while people understand, while people are paying attention, which is not very long. Lauren put together a really great cross-functional group of folks, some people who had a lot of experience with technology and with WebAuthn, some people who had zero technology or zero experience with WebAuthn and had never even heard of the service. And in 2 hours, they were able to deliver this Duke Unlock name and an elevator pitch that we could use to start formalizing and kind of A/B testing how we were talking about the service with folks. From the user engagement perspective, we realized it was important to have some baselines. And the things that we thought were most important, you can see here that we're measuring the trends here in Grouper, which is something that we love for tracking analytics and trends over time, and we have a whole other spiel on that for another day. But to measure the baselines, we wanted to check, how is our total user base going? How is our active user base going? What's happening with folks who registered but are not actively using it? And then a more qualitative sort of metric is, how are word of mouth referrals going? What happens when we stop telling anyone about Duke Unlock? Do we still see people signing up and telling each other about it? The other user engagement issue was campaigns, and we staggered these in order to make sure that we could measure the word of mouth thing. Again, our most major metric is, do people find this service relevant enough to tell their friends and colleagues? So we are trying to iterate. We want to make sure that we get enough people out there to notice some issues, some things that we can fix, and then put out a better version. So we intermittently would put something on Facebook or on Reddit or in a departmental newsletter, and we would watch what happened. How many people signed up from that department? How many people signed up from a different department where we can kind of imagine that that was because someone told them about it? And each time we did this, we would have sort of a post-mortem of what can we improve, and we would work with Lauren in the creative and UX group to figure out the best way to manage that. When it comes to easing registration, that's when we had the formal usability test, which was also managed by Lauren. We got really good feedback, which was great, because the value of having a usability researcher in there is to really dissect the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to give it to you straight. So I want to call attention to just one of these things because I think it shows that we are cool with the young people. Our service was called LIT. That is a professional achievement for both Shillen and me, and we can retire now, so that's great. So what we noticed were that a lot of the issues that we had with the usability research was related to our interim sending an invitation email process, which was not something that we ever envisioned as a long-term part of this. So one of our big takeaways there was that it was time for us to introduce self-service so that we could get away from the targeted invitation emails and start figuring out yet another minimal viable product. So that's where we dropped released the self-service, which had very little information on it. It basically said, here's the step-by-step how you are able to diagnose whether your supported device or whether your devices are supported. Let's make sure that we introduce a confirmation email, which was at Lauren's suggestion, because a lot of times people sign up and then they're interested, but they don't know how to get more information, and they often check their inbox to see if they got some sort of confirmation. So we introduced that. And then we realized that people are awful at naming their personal devices. And so being able to show the devices that you've registered with last used timestamps was very helpful to help people manage their device list. So for example, with what Tom mentioned, if you lose a device, we want to make sure that you can figure out which is the device that you need to get rid of. And if you called all three of your devices Shillen's Android, that may be a difficult thing for you. The last thing that we noticed when we were going through this was as soon as we released this and shared it, we got a lot of registrations, but we had some people who curiously registered successfully, but then never logged in. We realized we had to put some usability time into looking at the login link. People were not seeing that. I'm not going to read all of this stuff here, but we realized that there were some real problems with that link that we needed to make sure to fix. And that's where the concept for OneLink version, or for Duke Unlock version 2 came together, which is let's make sure that people can use that, set a default, and make the clicking a part of the onboarding process so that when people register, they understand how to log in case they gloss over the link. So this is what the new version of Duke Unlock looks like. So now that we have a name, the original link says use Duke Unlock to go passwordless. What we found is that if people can use this, they want to use this. So we should make it easy for them to set that as their default the first time that they do that. After you've done that with your initial login, you will see the button login. The button login has a focus in the browser that is set to the button. If you have more than one credential that is registered, you may see more than one username, for example, if you're using something with a service account. But you are able to literally, instead of having to type anything, you can just hit the return key and your device will prompt you for your WebAuthn transaction, which you can complete and log in. Before I hand this over to Shillen, I'm going to demo that for you really quick. So this is our staff management system. This is something that always requires multi-factor authentication. I haven't done anything but hit the URL. I will now hit return. Return prompts me out of Google Chrome to use the Touch ID on my MacBook Pro. So I will put my finger on that. And then I have logged in. That was multi-factor. I could have done it a lot faster if I weren't trying to demo it for people who are following along. But it is definitely the fastest way that we've found to offer multi-factor authentication that works for folks. So no context switching.
Yeah,
What's that?
Sure, hard to imagine it being any easier than that or usable than that.
Well, thank
I have
you.
to say, yeah.
So I'm going to hand it over to Shillen because we have some exciting announcements, and I want to make sure he gets to them.
Yep, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we plan on doing in the near future. So first of all, we're working very hard to make sure we're collecting good metrics so that we know what's working well and what's not working well. Right now, we haven't really advertised the service too much. We don't even have WebAuthn listed on our multi-factor authentication registration page. So because of that, we want to make sure that we have a clear and concise message that we can give to folks as we talk about the service while we're meeting with folks and passing for various unrelated reasons. We also want to make sure that we make changes to our registration page to track a few additional things, like how effectively do users identify compatible devices. So as you may have seen before in the screenshot, we list out the devices that we know work well with WebAuthn, but are users actually reading that, or are they just trying to register and potentially getting a failure? And what is the success rate for registration? Are users running into any other types of failures that we need to troubleshoot? How often do people need to re-register the same device? So for example, in Chrome, if you delete all of your Chrome data, so not just your cookies and your cache, but all of the data, that also deletes your WebAuthn credential. And so those users would need to re-register the same device. So how often is that happening? How often does one register and never use the service? Do registered users ever choose not to use Duke Unlock? So in our grouper environment, we created a grouper group where we keep track of all the users who have registered for the service but haven't used it recently. And we know of a few reasons why that might be the case. There could be folks who have work machines that don't have platform authenticators, but maybe they registered a personal phone or a home machine just to try out the service, but they don't use it every day. Or there could be cases where folks have a platform authenticator, but they generally dock their machines when they're using their computer, and so their fingerprint scanner may not be accessible, for example. So we're trying to figure out things like that. We're also working on removing some barriers at Duke. So we're working on some awareness efforts. For example, we want to make sure that the stores on campus know which laptops support WebAuthn well and which ones don't, so that when departments make purchasing decisions, that could be taken into account. Our security office holds password parties where they discuss best practices for account security and discuss other things like password managers, and we want to make sure this is included there. And of course, we need to mention our service on our MFA registration site. We also need to continue having regular deployments. We need to make sure that as new devices are supported, that is taken into account in our registration process, and that we continue making UI enhancements as well based off of our usability feedback. We need to continue working with IT support, in particular the departmental IT staff. When users and departments contact their staff for support, we need to make sure that they're aware of the service and have registered so that they can help out their own users. And also, if there are users that have systems that don't support or don't have platform authenticators right now, but the users are really interested in the service and they want to help test it and provide good information, we would be willing to circulate tokens for them as well. We're also working on tracking some community development. So at Duke, as far as mobile usage goes, iPhones are by far the winner as opposed to Android. And even though Android supports WebAuthn really well, iOS currently has some gaps, in particular with user verification. Although we've seen Apple make continued progress on this, so we're hoping those gaps will be closed soon. We're also keeping track of some Bluetooth support that Google has been working on. And we're also looking at some security keys with biometrics. We know Yubico is working on some of those security keys. Currently, the ones that they have only support PINs for user verification. But we have found that there are other vendors that do have biometric security keys, and we've bought a few of those to test them out. And I spoke about the OpenSSH thing earlier. I'm going to load quickly since we're running out of time. So here are some lessons that we've learned so far. Mary mentioned earlier that we were a little naive about how many users actually saved their passwords in their browsers, and we noticed that when we were walking people through registration. So that's just another reason why we need to get rid of passwords. There are many people that have compatible devices but never activated the Touch ID or Windows Hello, so they need to be walked through that. And then the nickname field is the only thing that we ask for users during the registration process, but some folks struggle with coming up with a good unique name for that. We've also discovered that people who aren't very engaged on account security for their Duke account are often very engaged on the security of their personal devices. So we're hoping to align our interests there. And we found that students really love the service. We've done very little to promote the service to them, but we see them registering all the time. So a lot of that must be word of mouth. And the last note there is that Mary broke her YubiKey a few months ago, and she used to use that for her second factor, but now just uses WedAuthn. And so as far as next steps go, last week I put out a version of our integration with Shibboleth into GitHub, and it's built on top of the InCommon Trusted Access Platform container. So you can literally download that and get a container running with this plugin in just a few minutes. We also have a discussion list where we're happy to discuss this further and answer any questions. And we actually have a position open on the IDM team. It's a senior development position that's open. So if anyone is interested in working on things like this, then come join our team.
And we hope we're not banned.
Okay, Shillen. That was a little sneaky at the very end there. If you actually could advance to the next slide while I take us out of here, just so that folks know there's more in the IAM Onlines to come. I just want to thank you both very much. There was one question I didn't quite get to, but that's the way it goes sometimes. I appreciate very much. And folks, if you do have further questions about this and there's not time, put them in the chat right now or send them to Dean or me or Mary or Shillen, and we'll try to get them addressed somehow. So with that, everyone have a great day.